Good evening. I'm Matt Castelli, and I'm running for Congress. Probably the most important pieces of information you can take away from our opportunity to get together here today. And I'm so excited for this opportunity. As many of you probably know, we've been doing town hall events in every single county of New York 21. After redistricting, New York 21 has expanded to be 15 counties. It's a big district, a lot of terrain to cover. We've put, I think right now to date, about 60,000 miles on my truck throughout the course of this campaign, being out in the community, having meet and greets and roundtables, and then town halls in which they're completely open. You know, we've really prioritized this because that's my expectation for a representative, somebody who's going to show up and engage with people across the political spectrum and have an opportunity to hear their concerns, their issues, elevate their hopes, the challenges that they're having, and to hear what, either they're a current member of Congress or an aspiring one, what they have to say about some things. And one of the caveats I throw out at the beginning of all of these is that as we have an opportunity to chat here tonight, I am not yet a member of Congress. And so I won't have a particular piece of legislation to point you to that I've worked on or passed, but I'll offer sort of my thoughts and comments on any issues that you raise here tonight. If there are some things that I don't have an answer to, I'll acknowledge that and pledge to you that I'll go work to go find the answer to those things. But the way we've sort of kicked all of these things off has been for me to offer just sort of some remarks at the beginning to introduce myself, why I'm running, and then we can open it up for questions. As Hannah alluded to, we are recording this because we'll put this online. And for each of the town halls that we've done, we have recorded them live in the environment and posted those on our YouTube channel. Because I do believe it's important for your representative to not just be available in the community, but also be ultimately accessible to folks. Whether that's in person in the community or online as well. So I'm Matt Castelli, running for Congress, born and raised in upstate New York in a bipartisan household. Dad's the Democrat, mom's the Republican. And maybe it's not much of a surprise that for much of my life, I was an independent. Now, I went to Siena College, not too far away. And when I was there 21 years ago, 9/11 happened. And that put me on a path to serve my country. I joined the CIA, and I served there for nearly 15 years. Doing counterterrorism work. I led teams hunting down some of the world's most dangerous terrorists. I worked in Afghanistan and Iraq and had enough success doing all of that work and worked in the same department that found Osama bin Laden. That's the kind of work that I did. But I was tapped by the Obama White House to come down and serve as the director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council, doing strategy and policy work. And it was a role that I was then asked by the Trump administration to stay on in, and I did. For the first year of the Trump White House, because in my belief, when it comes to our safety, security, and strength, it means putting country before party. And my belief in that has never wavered. Now, while I was at the White House, you're still a CIA officer. I was an apolitical civil servant. I went back to CIA when my rotation was up, and I did some work with cutting edge technology startups that were useful to our national security enterprise. I got a business degree at Northwestern. I was doing both of those things at the same time. And then COVID hit. Now, where I come from, not too far away in the Hudson Valley, it's not too far away from West Point. And my grandfather was an Army doctor at West Point. He got out of the Army, remained a physician, and he raised a family of nurses. Almost all of my family members are nurses, with the exception of my mother. She served in a different way. She became a teacher. But my grandfather instilled within our entire family this sense of duty, a duty to care for others. And so when COVID hit, and we got to a point pretty quickly in the pandemic where we were having this 9/11-like number in terms of death, about 3,000 deaths a day in this country, I decided this was the most compelling challenge of our time. So I left government after nearly 15 years, and I joined a healthcare organization here in New York, started by veterans to better coordinate care for veterans, rural communities, disadvantaged populations by connecting health and social care together. A real focus on our human and social service providers in the community, because that's where real health and well-being happens. Loved what I was doing, building out these coordinated care networks throughout the Northeast. It was really transformational. And then January 6th happened. Now, as you might imagine, a former counterterrorism guy like myself who spent a career trying to prevent things like that from happening in foreign capitals, to see it happen in our own didn't sit well with me. But what really didn't sit well with me was the response and actions in the run-up to, certainly that day and then since, of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. I think she sold out our country and our democracy. I think she violated her oath to the Constitution. It's the same oath that I took when I joined the CIA many years ago, to support and defend our Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so it wasn't long after that we decided to launch this campaign to challenge her, because I think democracy is important. I think this ongoing threat to our democracy is something that needs to be combated. But as I drive throughout the 15 counties that make up New York 21, a lot of folks are talking about how Congresswoman Stefanik has sold us out in other ways, that January 6th wasn't an isolated incident. She has really been focusing on her career and her career ambition and advancement, and it's come at the expense of our community. She sold out veterans. She sold out women. She sold out seniors. There are a number of examples that I can point to, and maybe we'll get to those during this discussion. But as I also travel, I hear from folks who they're tired of the extremes. They're tired of the divisiveness. They want a moderate, somebody that can unite us together and actually solve many of the compelling challenges and problems that we all have within our community, whether that's, the rising costs of daily life for working families and seniors. And so that's our top priority, not just in this campaign, but going forward, to make sure we've got an economy that works for everybody. They want somebody that's going to fight and defend our freedoms. Certainly a woman's right to choose and to be in control of her own body and healthcare decisions, but also the Second Amendment. And then somebody that's going to fight to make sure we've got safety and security for everyone. And yes, that's about fully funding our law enforcement, securing our borders. It's also about defending our democracy. And it's about protecting things like Social Security and Medicare. And so those are some of the top sort of priorities that we have right now going into this race, which, as you all know, is fast approaching here, Election Day. Many of you maybe have had the opportunity to vote already. Early voting is ongoing right now. It's been an exciting opportunity, not just to be in the community and to galvanize the strengths of support that we've seen. And again, not just from Democrats, independents and Republicans as well. And I'm excited about the coalition that we're building. I'm really excited about what we're going to deliver on Tuesday, a big win that I believe in, and it's going to be a resounding victory for our community as well as for the nation. But that's enough about me and why I'm running and sort of our orientation around the race. I'd love to sort of open it up for questions, and I think Hannah's going to manage the inbox, and we'll take them as they come.
Thanks, Matt. Everyone can drop in a question into the chat box if you'd like, or we have a bunch of questions that were submitted via the RSVP. I will do my best to get to as many of the questions as possible. I've also consolidated some of them. People asked questions about similar topics. So if you don't hear your specific question read, it's just because it was, the same kind of topic and we threw it all together. So bear with us, drop in any more questions as we go along. So let's start with Matt. You've been very connected to the communities of NY21 during your campaign. It has really impressed me how you spend day after day traveling to every corner of the district. How do you plan to maintain that connection when elected?
It's a good question, because I think it's an important, as I mentioned at the beginning, expectation that I have. If anybody's going to represent me, they have to be engaged with our community. And it is a big community. It's a big district. It's also one of these challenges is coming up with a term of art. It's not just the North Country. It's also the capital region. It's also about the Mohawk, Valley. It's about central New York and upstate New York. And it's about continuing to show up. And I think one of the people that I take some good examples from are people like now Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado. In areas of New York 19, not just in his election prospects, he was always relentless about, I think, having town halls in every single community. And that's my pledge, is to continue this. This isn't just for an election. This is about representation, because it's in each of those environments where we get to elevate the real concerns and issues and challenges and hopes that people have. And so my expectation is, and should be yours as well, is that we're going to continue doing this, can continue having in-person town halls in the communities that make up our district. We'll continue to have virtual events like these. And then for me, I think when we win on Tuesday, it's also about the expectation from a constituent services perspective to have real engagement within the community, to be available to address people's concerns about navigating the federal bureaucracy, to address the challenges that you're all facing. And so that's what real representation is. I'm applying for a job to be your, person down in Washington, D.C., to help you navigate the federal bureaucracy and to consistently be in the community to elevate your voice and concerns. And I think that's also one of the challenges that we've seen with our incumbent Congresswoman, is that she doesn't show up. And it's been really interesting to hear from folks, interesting is the word I'll use, about how long it's been since they've seen Congresswoman Stefanik in the community, how long it's been since she's availed herself of her constituents, how long it's been since she's had an open environment where all comers can come, not just, her supporters on one side, but everybody. And that's my pledge, is to always be a representative for everyone. And so in each of these environments, it's an open setting. You can come on in, let's have a discussion, because that's how our democracy works. or should work. That's how we can thrive, and that's how we can, I think, build a better path towards the future. So that's my commitment going forward.
Thanks, Matt. We got a lot of questions about inflation. If you could talk about that, and obviously the rising cost for working families.
Sure. I'm going to take a little time on this one because it's the top issue that you hear from everyone. So I'm the only person in this race, I believe, that has actually worked in our economy. And I bring that up because I think it's an important point that we have on one side a career politician in Congresswoman Stefanik, and then on the other side, yes, I did work in government, but I did work in the healthcare space, and I was doing business development sales. I had a job where I had a quota. I would have lost my job if I didn't hit my numbers. And I think a lot of folks are in that sort of perspective where you're got to hit your marks. You got to hit your sort of expectations in the economy, and you might lose your job or you might get downgraded or whatever it may be. I also do have a business degree. And I bring these things up because it's about really getting precision on this issue of inflation and to talk about it. And I'm going to try not to be too wonky on this. But inflation is global. We hear from the Stefaniks of the world that talk about it's all about democratic spending in Washington. That's why we have inflation in this country. Well, that's wrong. And maybe she should get a refund on that Harvard education that she's got because she's got the economics wrong on this. Inflation is global. There's nothing that's happened uniquely in the United States that has caused, 10%, 12% inflation in places like the UK or Europe. The inflation that we're all experiencing is a byproduct of the pandemic. What we saw with the pandemic is a global economy shut down, both demand and supply. After, as we've transitioned through the pandemic, demand has come back throughout much of the globe to include the United States, but the supply side didn't. And if you all remember back to high school economics, when demand outpaces supply, prices increase. That's like a classic, supply and demand curve. And so that's the situation we're in. And we've discovered that there are a lot of challenges within our supply chain. And that's on individual things, goods and services. Each one of those things has shown us that there are vulnerabilities, that there are pain points. And with that, we identify potential solutions. But I'm also going to come back to the piece that Congresswoman Stefanik is, making an argument that it's because of Democrats spending in Washington that we have this inflation. Well, not only is that wrong because of the global nature of it, but is it the same spending that she's falsely claiming credit for back here in the district? That's the spending that she's talking about. If she really believed that the spending in Washington was the cause of the inflation we're all facing right now, she wouldn't accept that spending or try to claim credit for it. You'd think she'd try to stop it, to stop this cause of rising prices for all of us. So there's a bit of a scam there, and I'll direct people to our website, castelliforcongress.com, where you'll see some examples in which she's tried to falsely claim credit for spending that she voted against in Washington, D.C. I'll give her credit. She did vote against it, but she shouldn't get credit for it here back in the district. But that's the kind of spending that she's alleging is causing the inflation that we have. But let's take her at her word what her plan is to address this issue. Her plan is to slash federal spending, the implications of which would be disastrous for us. We already know they're planning to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits for folks, and that would be disastrous for many of our seniors, to include my parents. We know that the kinds of things that she voted against are probably the things that she'd look to slash. And that means cops and nurses are going to lose their jobs. That means rural healthcare services are going to get slashed. That means broadband and infrastructure projects that we have or need are going to, stop. And so the implications there are real challenging for us. But we also have seen that there have been opportunities that they have attempted in Washington to alleviate specific pain points that we may have, whether that's bipartisan infrastructure to, create some sort of resiliency with our ports and our bridges to fix our supply chains. Stefanik voted against that. Stefanik voted against the CHIPS Act. That was an opportunity to create some degree of competition with China and manufacture here in the United States so that our supply chains begin and end at home these microchips, these semiconductors that find their way into everything from a vehicle to our cell phones to even our refrigerators now. One of the challenges we discovered with the pandemic was that we didn't have these things because they were being manufactured in China or they were being manufactured somewhere else in Asia, and we weren't able to get them here. So things were sitting, cars were sitting on lots, and despite a demand for them, we couldn't fulfill the supply, so the prices increased. This is how it's all interconnected. But in that regard, where Stefanik talks a good game about, wanting to make sure that we address these challenges, She voted against an opportunity to make America more competitive with China. She would rather let China win than let President Biden win. And that's, I think, a big problem we see right now in Washington, D.C. That's what we see a big problem with addressing the economic challenges that we have right now. Rather than being part of a solution for all of us, we're viewing it through the political lens. And I led off this discussion by talking about Congresswoman Stefanik being a career politician. Everything's a political lens for her. And right now, the proposal we're seeing is an opportunity for them to incur greater pain, economic pain for all of us. Rather than solving the challenges of inflation with a correct diagnosis and correct solutions for that, they want to bring more economic pain for the rest of us because the pain is the point. The reason why she hasn't been a part of any of those common sense solutions to alleviate inflation, the reason why their plan is to create more pain for us in the future is because they think it benefits them in an election right now and in 2024. We need to take the politics out of this, and we need to start focusing on real problem solving for these many challenges that we're facing. And when you talk to folks in our community about inflation, it's not just a number that we see on our television screens on the news. It's about the rising costs of real things affecting working families and seniors. It's about childcare. It's about housing. It's about transportation costs. It's about prescription drugs. It's about, food and groceries. Each one of those things has different solutions that needs to be brought to bear, and we need real people who are interested in solving them to create that kind of relief for working families and seniors in particular. Unfortunately, Congresswoman Stefanik has decided not to be a part of the solution. She wants to be part of creating more problems for the rest of us. And there's a real threat here to all of our economy as a result of the proposal going forward. So that's what's really on the ballot on Tuesday, an opportunity to bring to bear unity and bring people together to actually solve these problems rather than trying to create some sort of political benefit at all of our expense.
Thanks, Matt. One question that we got in various forms, people asking for themselves, their daughters, their granddaughters, is your stance on the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we saw this forecast when there was the leak of the plan for overturning Roe and then the actual Dobbs decision that came down. And the reality is that millions of American women are now under threat because their rights have been taken from them. The opportunity for them to make healthcare decisions for themselves or to be in control of their own bodies. And I've heard from women talking about the fear of being a second-class citizen, to not be fully enfranchised, to not have full rights as an American citizen. And that is a threat that millions of American women are now facing. But it's not stopping there, because we've seen people like Congresswoman Stefanik, unfortunately, she has signed on to and become the highest ranking Republican on the House side, who is pledged not just to co-sponsor, but to advance legislation for a national ban on abortion. Because some of the discussion we've had here in New York has been like, okay, that's happening around the rest of the country. That's terrible. But at least here in New York, we've got protections. Not if that federal ban comes into play. That federal ban would target blue states or New York and the protections that we have. And that's a real challenge that we're facing that's on the ballot right now. I believe very firmly that women should be in control of their own bodies and in their own healthcare decisions without interference from the government. Full stop. And the only way to make sure that we have that restored, not just to protect for women here in New York, but to restore it for millions of American women across this nation, is to pass once and for all into federal legislation to codify a woman's right to choose into federal law so that we're protected once again. And that's, again, what's on the ballot this November, is the opportunity to have enough folks in the House and in the Senate to pass that legislation, to pass that into federal law. And that's my commitment. And sometimes people have asked me, what's the first thing you want to do as a member of Congress? That's my response. I want to be able to vote on and advance legislation because that threat is real. That threat is immediate. That threat is ongoing, and we need to address it on an immediate basis.
Thanks, Matt. We've gotten a couple questions about the increasing violent rhetoric and negative rhetoric and spreading of misinformation, lies in commercials, things like that. So if you could talk about kind of the political temperature right now and how we combat it.
Well, as a first-time candidate, I guess I'm on the brunt of some of this. And I know that I've gotten into the big leagues when you start seeing, lies and smears being directed at yourself. But I think one of the real challenges that we have is how far the rhetoric and the lies and the attacks have gone. And I'm a former counterterrorism official. I know firsthand that extremist rhetoric can lead to extremist violence. We're all watching on our news channels the aftermath of this terrible attack against Nancy Pelosi's husband. That was an attempted assassination against the Speaker of the House, the number 3 in the line of succession in the United States. That is a real problem. And we're now seeing, both through that individual's sort of troubled admissions from the rhetoric that he has consumed about the things that were drivers for him. You know, questions and concerns around the legitimacy of the 2020 election and what Democrats are doing. I think what we've seen has been this rise of the demonization of the other. That's always been a core component of any kind of extremist violence that we've seen throughout the history of probably man. But we're now seeing, and I think unfortunately so, the mainstreaming of extremist rhetoric by political leaders. We're certainly seeing it on cable news by folks like Tucker Carlson, but we're seeing folks like Congresswoman Stefanik, again, unfortunately, using their platforms to spew and mainstream extremist rhetoric that seeks to demonize others. We saw this last year in particular with this great replacement theory that she had promoted and used through fundraising and a message that she put out there that was very racist, anti-immigrant. And it was that very same thing, the great replacement theory, that motivated a domestic terrorist in Buffalo, New York, to kill 10 people. These are the kinds of things that we're now seeing come to the fore in American political life that I don't think many of us throughout our lifetimes had seen in such a way embraced by senior leaders of a political party. And I think it comes really down to this lack of respect for human dignity, that somehow the political win that people are seeking needs to come at the expense of a shared and respect for one another and a shared appreciation for the fact that we're all human beings, worthy of respect, worthy of dignity, and that there is no place for violence in certainly our political. Still a counterterrorism professional, by definition, terrorism is defined as violence or the threat of violence in pursuit of a political aim. We see and are seeing terrorism all over the place right now, people pursuing a political objective through violence. And we're not seeing enough denunciation of that. We're also seeing this, I think, aptitude or the desire to paint a whole group of individuals based upon maybe their political affiliation as being the enemy. I mentioned before at the beginning, I grew up in a bipartisan household. My dad's a Democrat, mom's a Republican. I love Republicans, quite literally. I love my mother. She is a Republican. There is no issue that I have with Republicans or the Republican Party. I have issues with individuals. I have issues with their policy proposals. I have issues with their perspective that I think is unhelpful, potentially even harmful. But when we start seeing people saying the Democrats are the problem or the Republicans are the problem, and then we start turning off our ability to talk with folks just based upon that identification, and then go a step further when we start saying that they're responsible for your lot in life, they're the ones who are responsible for the pain that you're feeling. We're seeing leadership in political parties weaponize that desire. And this has always happened. I mean, many people make these allegories to, what happened in Nazi Germany. I mean, there is a real threat here of the rise of fascism, unfortunately, in pursuit of political aims. And there's, I think, what ties into this growing threat to our democracy. The vibrancy of our democracy relies on common respect for one another, and that we will sort out our differences and our different perspectives on matters of policy at the ballot box. We don't do it in terms of political violence. We don't do it in name calling. We don't do it in attacking the other and demonizing the other, because it's only when you dehumanize folks do people start feeling that they have license to attack violently or to, unfortunately, maybe even some instances, kill. And that's a real threat that I don't see enough folks talking about, and one that we need to really fight back against.
Thanks, Matt. All right, let's jump into some regional specific questions we've gotten. We got one highlight that you had been in Plattsburgh recently. So do you support a feasibility study for a bridge from Plattsburgh to Vermont?
We had a town hall, was a week ago, 2 weeks ago in Plattsburgh, and this issue did come up. And one of the things I did was, well, let me get your perspective on this. And we started to hear from folks all across the room. It was a well-attended town hall, I think well over 100 people there. And we got a lot of different perspectives there. But one of the things that I think folks highlighted was that there was a desire and a need for greater transportation options between particularly Plattsburgh and Vermont, and the ability to access new marketplaces, healthcare. We had some folks that were incurring thousands of dollars of costs a month just in taking the ferry to get access to their doctor. That seems to be unacceptable. And it seems to be that there needs to be some sort of examination of alternatives. And so I think I would definitely support, with local voices being involved and elevating this issue, a feasibility study to look at the prospect of what it would take to create maybe a bridge or some alternative transportation options that people weren't incurring the challenges of just simply relying on a privately managed ferry and the cost associated with that.
Thanks, Matt. We've gotten a lot of questions about your stance on gun safety, if you can elaborate.
Sure. This has been a topic of conversation for this campaign, I think all across the nation, certainly in the aftermath of terrible events like what happened in Uvalde, Texas. But let me say off the bat, because we were just talking about what we see in our political discourse about lies and misinformation. There have been a few lies that have been spread about me in my positions on firearms and the Second Amendment by my opponent, Congresswoman Stefanik. So let me be very, very clear about this. I'm a gun owner. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. The Second Amendment's a key part of that. It's not going anywhere, certainly under my watch. And I have spent more time on the range and downrange using firearms in war zone environments like Afghanistan and Iraq as a tool to protect this country, not a political prop that we see folks like Congresswoman Stefanik utilize it for. So strong support of the Second Amendment, gun owner myself. But we have to realize in the aftermath of these terrible events like a slaughter of children in Uvalde, Texas, in a school, or the recognition of this terrible statistic that gun violence is now the #1 cause of death of children in this nation, that we need to do more and we need to do better. Now, in our area, I think we are a great example of gun responsibility and gun safety, and that there are common sense solutions that we can bring to bear to reduce the rates of gun violence, to keep our kids and communities safe. We want to make sure that our law enforcement aren't being outgunned when they show up at a challenging crime scene. We want to make sure that our parents have the right to know that their kids are going to survive the school day. And the way we do that is around common sense, universal background checks, empowering our law enforcement with the tools that if they identify someone who poses a harm to themselves or to others, that they can remove from that person the tool by which to pose a real harm to themselves or to others. That's where you can bring together in what I believe is a winning coalition to address this problem. Folks like me, gun owners, strong supporters of the Second Amendment, those in our community that want to keep our kids and communities safe. It's around common sense. And maybe it's no surprise that the moderate wants to bring people together in the middle. But the real challenge we have, certainly in the two different candidates that we have, is that Congresswoman Stefanik is way out on the far extreme on this issue, in no small part due to the fact that she's married to a member of the gun lobby. And she's working hard to make sure that every single cop killer, kid killer, domestic abuser, terrorist have whatever weapons they want to terrorize our communities. That's a problem, and I reject that. And most of us, I think, in our community reject it. I also, on the other side of the spectrum, you have some folks who want to abolish the Second Amendment or ban all kinds of different classes of guns. I reject that as well, because I don't think that that's useful or helpful. It's also not realistic. I think where we can come to terms and address this challenge that we're all facing, particularly in protecting our kids and communities, is around common sense. And that's right in the middle there in some of the proposals that I just described.
Thanks, Matt. We've gotten a couple of questions about how people respond to that discussion of building a coalition. What's one of the misperceptions? What's the negative comment that you hear the most and you don't want to hear? How do you kind of combat that feeling?
Well, I think one of the challenges you hear in our political discourse is that there are some folks that don't want to have a nuanced discussion. There are some folks that it's my way or the highway. There are some folks that don't see the world in shades of gray. They see it in black and white. And some of those folks tune you out and they don't want to be a part of a coalition to solve a problem. And sometimes I think it's challenging because it happens on many of these complex issues that are certainly gray and nuanced and require people to come together with different perspectives to identify real solutions. And one of the things that I sort of respond to in this political climate that we're in is that we don't really do other things in our lives this way. I venture to say that many people in their households don't have one person saying it's my way or the highway. They might, but in the household I grew up in, if we identify a problem, come together to figure out what the solution may be. And maybe many of your workplaces, a problem is identified and people come together with different perspectives and they identify a solution. May not have been the initial solution that one person wanted or another, but it's a solution nevertheless. Our political discourse has gotten to the point where it's one side versus the other in a way that it's like professional wrestling for the entertainment value of it. Or it's gotten us to an intractable point where you can't advance a decision because someone has to oppose you because they're from the other side. The politics of opposition, in which we were talking a little bit earlier, rather than having folks like Congresswoman Stefanik be a part of a solution on inflation, her job is to say, nope, we're going to incur as much pain as possible because our job is to win an election. And we have to blame Democrats in order to win that election. That's not solving any problems for our community. That's not solving any problems for the American people. The only way we can do that is by coming together through coalition building. The only way we can come together, I think, is in the middle. And we need to support moderate voices, in my view, because I believe that the far left and the far right have dominated our political discourse, and it's become the celebrity of who's the loudest voice in the room. Most of us in the middle feel left out. We don't have a voice anymore. And that's what we're seeking to try to restore, not just with this election, but that's, I believe, how you govern more effectively is by bringing people together. Those of you who were probably around during this time frame, as we talk about these issues right now about Social Security and Medicare and their solvency going forward, one of the last times we addressed this issue was during the Reagan administration. And Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill came together and they increased the longevity of Social Security. We need more of that. We need people who are well-intended, who want to come together in a room and say, listen, the American people expect a result here. They expect us to solve a problem or we're going to get fired. And that should be, as voters, our expectation for them to be working on problems facing our country and community, not how good of a Republican they are in combating the Democrats and how good of a Democrat they are in combating the Republicans. When we were talking earlier about the prospect of the demonization of a whole class of people identified with a political party, the whole point of making so much effort, whether it's cable news or social media or politicians, in focusing on the other is to distract us from the fact that they're not being part of problem solving. We need problem solving. And we need people to, I think, I'm going to use my vote going forward in this election and others, based on who's going to be best positioned to solve the problems that I care most about, or the ones that I believe are affecting our country or our community. And that's something I'd like to see elevated more as an expectation for solving problems.
Thanks, Matt. I have an easy question for you. Is it true that you never voted in the district?
It's not true. Again, one of the other sort of lies that has been spread throughout the course of this campaign. I certainly have voted in the district. And when it comes to the district, I'm the only one who lives in the district. Some folks may not realize that after redistricting, Congresswoman Stefanik doesn't live in New York 21. In fact, on November 8th, I'm the only one in this race that's going to be able to cast a vote in this election because Congresswoman Stefanik lives outside of New York 21. She can't even vote for herself. So at least we've got one vote advantage. I'm going to disclose that I will be voting for myself on November 8th. So there's 1+ for Castelli. And Congresswoman Stefanik, unfortunately, she can't even vote for herself because she doesn't live in New York 21. She lives further. I know there have been some discussions about upstate and downstate. She lives further downstate than I do. So she's the real downstater. I'm the one who's in upstate.
It's a good continuation of all the lies that we see out there in the political ethos right now. Let's dive into emergency services, particularly in our rural areas. So there's enrollment decreasing, there's the costs, of course, the aging population. How do we deal with EMS in our rural communities?
Yeah, and this is very timely because just yesterday, I was in Herkimer County meeting with MOVAC in Mohawk. This is a not-for-profit emergency services provider, and it covers a number of the townships within Herkimer County. And we were talking about the many challenges that they're facing in terms of sustaining their effort and actually providing the kind of coverage and the response time that's necessary. And this is a challenge we've seen all throughout our district. In many instances, we've got all volunteer corps, and we don't have volunteers. We don't have towns that are able to sustain or provide the funding. And in many rural areas, this life-saving capability really makes a difference between life and death, because we already have significant distances in terms of accessing the kinds of care and services that we need. And so when we don't have the kind of ambulatory or emergency services that we can rely on to provide emergency critical care at that moment and then get us to the kinds of services that we need, people are going to die. People are going to get sicker, and there are going to be more and more challenges. I think we need to really take a hard look, because I don't believe that this is unique to our district. It's a big problem for our district, but I think that this applies in many rural communities throughout the country. There have been some bills that have been drafted, but haven't really fully advanced to provide for some funding. We see funding going towards police and fire, but not as much toward EMT and emergency services. So we need to, I think, have a full-scale effort around that, and I think identify solutions. And I'd like to be a part of this in working with a governor and state legislators about where we can leverage federal dollars at the state level to improve the access that we need and come up with some mechanism that it's not different depending on where you go. I mean, to hear these different models in terms of the agreements that some of the volunteer services have, or nonprofits do, or even for-profit have with local townships, and who's getting paid what, and who's getting reimbursed from Medicaid and Medicare and private insurers. There are too many complexities there that prevent, I think, the model to work and be able to really provide the kind of coverage that we need. We need to simplify the system. We need to provide wholesale support from the federal government on down to make sure that these critical services are provided. But this does tie into sort of an overall challenge with healthcare in our environment, that we got services being shut down at even hospitals that we have. I don't know if anybody on the net here is from Franklin County, and Alice Hyde up in Malone. We don't have a maternity ward there anymore. There's no maternity ward in Schoharie County. You know, if women are going to give birth, they got to do it in an emergency room, or they got to seek, maternal health care hours away. We need to have traditional clinical acute healthcare services in our communities, but we also need other services as well. I mentioned earlier that I spent some time in the healthcare sector working with human and social service providers. That's where health and well-being happens. We need to have mental health resources and behavioral health resources and substance abuse. And those full suite of care needs to be available in every single community within a reasonable proximity so that we can thrive. And those are the kinds of investments we haven't had made during the last 8 years with our sitting member of Congress. This is someone who hasn't fought for those resources. Any resources that have come here have come despite her. She's only gotten 2 bills passed into law. We saw even just recently $13 million for rural health care that she delivered, but she voted against. We need somebody who's going to be down in Washington fighting for those resources to come back to our community, to make the investments we need to have people where they can thrive, where we want to keep people. We want to keep families together. And access to the full suite of resources and to provide the emergency services when necessary is a part of that equation.
Thanks, Matt. You've gotten a couple questions on this one and some other versions of it, but what's your stance on protecting gay marriage and other rights that are now at risk post the Dobbs decision? Yeah,
listen, we want to protect gay marriage. We want to protect the dignity that I was talking about earlier of all human beings. And when we start talking about gay LGBTQ plus rights, those are human rights, and they need to be protected at federal law. And we're starting to see this rise of this threat, not just in the aftermath of a Dobbs decision and forecasting what rights that we previously maybe took for granted being eroded, but we're starting to see some aggressive legislation that's coming in places like Florida and elsewhere across the nation. There are even some reflections that a Republican majority in Congress would have a Don't Say Gay bill at a federal level. These are real challenges to communities that deserve respect and dignity and protection and equality, true equality. And the only way to actually protect that is through federal legislation. 2, protect those communities. And so I'm a full supporter of the Equality Act and the ability to make sure that particularly our LGBTQ plus community have the rights that they deserve. We need to be able to fight for that. There should be no place for discrimination, not in America. We've seen, I think, an opportunity in our lifetimes where we have achieved significant, tremendous progress for communities that had previously been discriminated against. We don't go backwards in this nation. The only direction we have is forward. That is the hallmark of our nation, the hallmark of our democracy is a forward-oriented direction. So I'm going to protect against that kind of erosion. And one of the things I'll also highlight for folks on this particular issue is I want to sort of put my money where my mouth is when it comes to representation. My team is represented by the LGBTQ community. I want to make sure that it's not just as a person who's aspiring for office and a campaign team. That's something that as a member of Congress, I would also seek to have that diversity, that equity, that inclusion to make sure we had that kind of a representation in the team. Full acknowledging that I am a straight, single, white male. And I want to make sure that we have diverse input that is being provided to me as we continue to elevate everyone's voice down in Washington.
Thanks, Matt. Let's talk about short-term rentals and housing issues in the district.
Yeah. Boy, we get so mired in the discussion about inflation that when you actually take a notch into it, we start identifying what are real cost drivers for folks and what are the real challenges. I touched on, I think, childcare earlier, but the other big challenge that I hear consistently all throughout our community is about the lack of affordable housing. And so much of that is due to the challenges we see with the supply. Again, it's a supply and demand challenge. We have no shortage in the beautiful environment that we live in of a desirable place to live. But we have challenges on the supply for places to actually live in, to habitate, quality, affordable housing. North Country Public Radio has done some good work on this in sort of exploring through a series of articles about the challenge that we have. And some of it's tied to the short-term rental challenge that we have because it is a tourism driver. There are economic benefits to us. Some of that is managed on a local level, and I'm very hesitant from a federal government perspective to get into local determinations for zoning and restrictions that happen on a county or town basis. I don't necessarily believe is an appropriate role for the federal government, but where I do think that there is an opportunity is around the supply of housing opportunities. Some of that's, we already do have existing structures. It may not be in certain communities that we need new structures built to provide that additional housing. In some instances, it's about, renovating existing structures. We drive throughout some communities and see a lot of blight. We want to make sure that we've got the resources within our local communities to be able to take care of that. And some of that might be, I've used this phrase a little bit called raise, renovate, rebuild, RAZ. Is there the opportunity where we, through around rural housing, can provide federal dollars to, take down dilapidated buildings that are not just an eyesore, but they're a threat and they're unsafe, and then potentially, rebuild or existing structures that are not unsafe, and we could do some renovations to them to create those affordable living spaces. And a lot of it too is around the orientation. Some people think about affordable housing and they get an aversion because they think it's around low income. Really, it's around middle income. It's about the starter home for a small family that's just trying to get started with their lives, or it's the recent college grad that is struggling with student loans and needs to be able to afford housing and trying to get a job in an environment that they want to, maybe recreate in. How do we create the conditions? And housing is a key sort of piece of that infrastructure that we need for communities that can thrive. And so it's really around identifying the supply opportunities that we can bring to bear through, I think, additional federal resources to increase the supply. But again, I just want to caution, it's not necessarily going to be a cookie cutter, let's build new structures in places where we're not allowed to build new structures. And many of you understand, the park creates certain restrictions in terms of where we can build and where we can't. And, a lot of that is going to be governed not just with the park, the APA, but also through local townships in determining where there may be some opportunities. But I think that there is a clear role for the federal government to provide some resources. And I know that there are some land banks and, the innovative ideas that some towns have started to work through in order to solve this problem. I think the federal government through federal resources can supercharge some of those innovative ideas to create some solutions for the affordable housing challenge that we have.
Thanks, Matt. Let's combine a couple questions here. What do you plan to do to increase sustainable jobs? How do you address green tech? How do you address climate change, particularly in our district?
Okay, so let's just take the economic piece of this first. We've already hit on a couple of things about the investments that we need in childcare and housing and healthcare and human and social services. We need additional investments in broadband and cell service and just, roads and bridges. It's really around the common themes of hard infrastructure, technical infrastructure, and human infrastructure that have long gone unaddressed over the last 8 years to bring us up to modern day. Because even if somebody wanted to have an opportunity to grow a business here, those pieces aren't in place in many communities throughout our district. We need to be able to make that baseline infrastructure around hard, technical, and human in our communities to create a space where people can live, work, and play to thrive. I believe that when you put those pieces into place and create a space where people want to stay, many folks have dealt with the challenges probably of their kids or their grandkids moving away for economic opportunities because they didn't feel like they had any here. Not only are they going to want to stay here, but maybe we can attract others. When you create a space to retain and attract talent, employers will come. It's kind of like the Field of Dreams model. We build it, they'll come. I think that's a great way to prioritize investment and support from the federal government to create economic opportunities and real economic growth. And every single one of those investments that I just articulated, those are pro-economic growth investments. They're not, opportunities just to create a space for people to have benefit. This isn't just a social giveaway. This is an opportunity to grow our economy. And so those investments will have returns on those dollars. And I believe that they're a priority for our community because, again, they've long gone unaddressed. But that's the kind of space that we need to really prioritize, but also to seize upon like the new and exciting technologies of the future. I mentioned before the CHIPS Act that Congresswoman Stefanik voted against to give a gift to China. But we've seen those dollars start to come to upstate and create good paying, great jobs. Micron in Clay, New York, or down in the Hudson Valley, opportunities for huge investments. But they're not coming to this area of upstate New York because we don't have a federal representative who's fighting for those dollars. We need somebody who's going to seize upon the technologies of the future to create economic growth. And some of that is around the green collar jobs. Those are opportunities where we could really be leading, not just the state, but maybe even this region of the United States by creating opportunities, leveraging the abundant natural resources that we have, wide open spaces for solar and wind, a lot of waterways for hydroelectric power. There are wonderful opportunities to create good paying, some instances, union jobs to grow our economy, seizing upon the need that we have for alternative energy sources. We need to diversify our energy sector. That's one of the solutions to create downward pressure to alleviate the costs that we're all suffering at the pump through fossil fuels. Diversification, I'm a capitalist, full disclosure, I believe in capitalism. Capitalism works through competition. We benefit with reduced prices from entities competing with one another for our business. That doesn't exist in an exclusive sort of fossil fuel industry. We need to diversify that. We're all recognizing that strong need, that strong demand for diversification. We can seize upon those opportunities if we make those investments. When we do make those investments, we're not only growing our economy, we're producing and protecting our environment. And we're combating climate change, which so many of us realize is not just an existential threat to our planet and humanity, but it's a real threat to our economy. Whether it's tying it into the tourism dollar that we have with our ski slopes, and making sure that we've got a ski season that is, a certain amount of time with great quality snowpack, or the threat that, severe weather comes in and maybe, devastates with some flooding, a small family farm and their crop for a season. We have to take we have to take this threat of climate change very seriously and combat it, but seize the opportunities associated with it. And we can't afford not to. I think last year alone, we spent $150 billion as a nation on disaster recovery efforts from climate-related disasters. We can't keep increasing those costs from these, more and more severe weather issues. We need to take proactive steps to fight back against this and seize the economic opportunities that come with it.
Thanks, Matt. So this is a two-part question. Got a couple versions of it as well. But once you're in Congress, what are your top two legislative priorities and what are committees you'd want to sit on?
I'm going to take the second one first. The two committees that I'd like to sit on right away are the House Armed Services Committee. Fort Drum remains in the district, and I want to be a strong voice and representative for our men and women in uniform, having served alongside them in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but then also all throughout my career. We need, I think, a strong voice that understands what they need from someone in Congress to be their voice and to make sure they're providing adequate and real oversight over the executive, regardless of who's in the White House. And we haven't had that in Congresswoman Stefanik. Unfortunately, she's been asleep at the wheel. She didn't provide oversight around Afghanistan. I'll give a good example of that instance. On 12 May, when the Pentagon came in for their plans for withdrawal from Afghanistan, she failed to participate in the meeting because she was voting Liz Cheney out of office that day. She's always got time for her career, but not for our national security or our men and women in uniform. She's somebody that's prioritizing these culture war attacks and really disrespecting men and women of our military, like Mark Milley, General Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's a former 10th Mountain Division and Fort Drum commander. And they're launching all kinds of culture war attacks against them. So the list is long in terms of what we need really in changing a real representative who's going to respect and provide the kind of service and support for our men and women in uniform. But in addition to the House Armed Services Committee, I'd like to also be on the Agricultural Committee, because I think any representative of our region with such a strong agricultural tradition and the backbone of our economy, we need to have a strong voice at the highest levels of government in Washington, really shaping legislation that's going to impact and drive the success of our small family farms all throughout our district. So those are the two committees. In terms of legislation, I think the first one I already alluded to that I want to be a part of and driving is to codify a woman's right to choose into federal law. The other thing that I think I'd like to do is around this, the affordable housing in rural areas. I do think that there is a tremendous opportunity and a need that can help grow our economy and address real cost pressures that people are facing right now and start to lead to growth. And that's not just a challenge that I hear from, working families. When I talk to chambers of commerce, the two things that they highlight for me in terms of facing their members, their small businesses within their community, are lack of access to affordable childcare and affordable housing for workers, because we do have workforce shortages. And this also ties back into the inflation challenges. If you don't have enough workers to produce more widgets or provide more services, those things start increasing in cost. So it's all interrelated. And those are the kinds of things that I'd like to work on in order to really reduce the costs that we're all facing.
Thanks, Matt. Let's talk about term limits and trust in government.
This is my favorite topic. And one of the comments that I made in our last town hall, because it was our last, at least in person, was that every single time we talk about this, it maybe is the biggest applause line, because people are, I think, really desiring a restoration of trust between us, citizens, and our government, because that trust has been broken. It's been broken probably by both parties that have eroded that trust, because we don't believe that we have the kind of confidence that we should have in elected representatives working for us. They seem to be working for themselves. And I'll actually give some credit to former President Trump. He came up with a term of art when he was first running for office. He talked about these politicians who go down to Washington and only seem to be interested in their reelection prospects and really just focused on that next reelection and the corporate donors and not focused on the people they were elected to represent. And he called them the swamp. And I think he was right. And I think he was right because Congresswoman Stefanik is really the quintessential example of the swamp. She is someone who's only interested in advancing her own career at our expense. She's already voted against our interests time and time again. So we need to restore trust by having a government of, by, and for the people. And the best way we can do that is through term limits and a couple of other areas that I'll get into. But on the term limits front, we already have it in the executive branch, 8 years, 2 terms. We need that in every other branch of government, to include the Supreme Court. I think we can restore some trust and confidence with the Supreme Court if we institute some degree of term limits. But I'll focus on the House because that's what I'm aspiring to. I believe we should limit members of Congress and the House side to 4 terms, 8 years total. And if I'm not able to pass that into law by the time I'm out, I will limit myself to 4 terms. I've made this pledge. I will pledge to term limit myself just to 4 terms. But I think the trust factor needs to go beyond simply the term limits, because it's the influence of money. We got to get all of this corporate money and the dark money out of politics, because we see people like Congresswoman Stefanik who are so interested in padding their campaign coffers in support of their next reelection that those are the people they're listening to, not the rest of us. She's got plenty of time to have sit-down meetings with corporate executives. She doesn't have any time to have a town hall with you all or a debate with me. So that's a real problem. We need somebody who's going to represent us. And so I think we got to get the money out of politics. I also want to see us ban members of Congress and their family members from holding or trading stock. I think that this is a common sense solution that could create a tremendous amount of trust to ensure that members of Congress are working for us, not their stock portfolios. And here, I'm going to point out, I'm a moderate, and I'm going to call out both parties when I see that they are doing something that's wrong. And unfortunately, in this regard, there's somebody that I have a good relationship with. She's provided support to our campaign and endorsement, Abigail Spanberger, representative out of Virginia, who has championed this kind of legislation. She's a moderate. She thinks that this is a great opportunity to restore some degree of trust, and I agree with her. And she called out, appropriately so, Speaker Pelosi for not advancing a bill to ban members of Congress and their family members from holding or trading stock. And I think that in this regard, Speaker Pelosi is certainly wrong. This bill should move forward. It should get voted on, and it should get passed, because I think it would do a tremendous service to restoring trust between the rest of us and our government.
Thanks, Matt. So we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask you 2 things. The first is to tell people why they should vote for you without mentioning Stefanik.
Okay.
And tell them how they can get involved in the next 5 days.
Yeah. So I believe that I included, deserve a representative who's going to focus on our future, who's going to put us and our families first. And I'm somebody that has always put my country and community first. And you can count on me to always continue to do that. And the American people have already placed their faith and trust in me at one point in time to protect our nation from terrorism. And I'd ask members of the New York 21 community to trust me, to always put their families first. And I will do so. That's my commitment in this regard. We need somebody that can do that. And I certainly pledge to do it. When it comes to I'll reiterate the priorities that I outlined at the very beginning: fighting to reduce costs around childcare, healthcare and prescription drugs, and housing, so that working families and seniors can get a break. That's a top priority for me. Making sure we're going to defend our freedoms, women's right to choose, and the Second Amendment. Making sure we're fighting for safety and security by fully funding and supporting our law enforcement, securing our borders, defending our democracy, huge issue for me, one of the reasons why I'm in this race. And then also protecting Social Security and Medicare, which are on the chopping block if we see a Republican majority take Congress. And certainly people like, I won't say her name, but if we see something happen, we want to prevent that from happening. And so that's what I'm fighting for, and that's why I'm here. I'm always going to fight for you. That's always going to be my priority. The ways you can get involved in the next 5 days, we have plenty of opportunities. Phone banking is an important opportunity right now to call folks, to energize them, to mobilize them, to get them to the polls. We're door knocking. We're all throughout the course of this weekend. It's GOTV, get out the vote. Please join us. Participate in canvasses, to knock on doors, spread our message on social media. But now's the time. Now's the time to get involved. And I'll leave it to Hannah or anybody else on our team if they want to enumerate any other opportunities here. But it is, democracy is not a spectator sport. This is the most important election of our lifetimes. And I think it will set the tone for the future of our democracy. Maybe if it's going to be a democracy or if it's not, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that that's on the ballot this November. But I think also the threat that we see for whether we're going to have someone and people fighting for our future to actually address these many challenges, or if it's just going to be this cycle of one team versus the other for some endless period of time. We need to restore this voice to the great moderate majority, and that's what I'm fighting for.
Thanks, Matt. On that note, everyone, you can sign up to volunteer on our website, castelliforcongress.com. There's a tab that says volunteer. We are phone banking every single night, as Matt said, so join us. Help make sure that everyone brings a friend to the polls. Everyone has a plan to vote. Early voting's through Sunday. And thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to earn your vote on November 8th. I would be humbled and honored to do so, and I'll always fight for you.